New York Times bestselling author Tim Brown joins me on this episode of the No One Is Watching podcast. We discuss, among other things, Tim's new book, The Tao of the Backup Catcher, and how that population of players represent what so much of us seek to be in our everyday life, present and a good teammate. We also discuss two of his past books and how they each portray a different version of a similar theme, how we deal with adversity. Tim, it's awesome to see you, man. It's been a little while.
Billy, it's a pleasure. I'm thrilled to be here. This is fun. One of the people I always enjoyed talking ball with most was you, and so this runs me back to the days where it was just standing in a clubhouse and kicking stats around and guys around and standings around and all that stuff. So it's great to catch back up again.
Yeah, likewise. I was actually thinking that this morning that you always stood out to me because you always felt like you leaned a little bit into more of the human element side of the game, as opposed to plenty of other writers that you just they cozy up to you and they're just standing there and they're just looking for the scoop. You know, they're just looking to overhear something or glean something from you or from somebody else. And the conversations we always had always seemed very authentic and just driven by sort of the people that are involved in the game, both on and off the field, which is I think it comes across in your writing, but it's part of the reason I've always enjoyed chatting with you too.
Well, I appreciate that. I think that's a really kind way of saying I'm probably not bright enough to understand the analytics part of the game. So it left me exactly one avenue, and that's like, hi, I'm Tim. Tell me your story, man.
Right. Well, that could be a blessing. That could be a blessing in disguise. You never know.
Right.
So before we get into the new book, which I'm super excited about, I want to talk about your previous two, because one thing that I spend a fair bit of time just trying to study and bone up on myself a little bit is adversity and people that go through it and how they get through it and what they get out of it. And two really unique stories that you wrote. One about Jim Abbott, for those who don't know, guy who was born without a hand and wound up carving out a very successful professional career as a major league pitcher. And then one about Rick Ankiel, who was sort of on the other end of the spectrum, was everybody's All-American, the next coming of Mickey Mantle, and two-way superstar in high school, and gets to the big leagues and has quite a bit of success, and then hits what seems to be, I don't know if it's unique to baseball or not. You may know better than I do. The only thing I can equate it to in another sport is like the guy that just can't hit a free throw to save his life, but can do everything else in the game. He gets the yips and just has this mental block about throwing the ball. A guy that, all his life, that's all he did better than anybody else, was throw a ball and hit a ball and things like that. So let's start with Jim Abbott, I guess, the book you wrote with him. It's such an incredible story, even if you're not a sports fan, but the guy that can overcome those odds and be successful to the extent he was just kind of blows my mind.
Yeah. So to backtrack a little bit, Jim's rookie year, 1989 with the Angels, was my first year covering Major League Baseball. And I was at the LA Daily News at the time. And so we sort of grew up in the game together a little bit. We're sorting out the major leagues at the time. I was just a punk, and he was a guy with like everybody hanging off him and wanting to know how this was happening and all that. And we had stayed. I will say this about Jim, and I have never seen a guy take a loss harder than Jim Abbott did. He was so driven to win baseball games. And as he was growing up, he had considered every step that he took in terms of baseball as a gift, because he thought at some point he was going to need the other hand, that there was going to be a roadblock. And that started back on the playground, where he wouldn't be picked for sandlot games, and he would put his glove back on his bike handlebars and ride back home. And his dad would tell him, I don't want to see any tears. You get back out there and figure out a way. And So, it was that way into Little League, into high school ball, into college ball, into the Olympics, into the Pan Am Games, into the big leagues without stopping at the minor leagues. And so he was such an interesting character. He by that point had decided uh, that this was going to be a battle, that this was going to be a fight, and that he was going to win. And it was really important to him to be judged solely as a pitcher, which it's a battle that nobody else has, right? I just want to be graded out, if you will, as a pitcher, which is what Don Welke had done. The scout who found him, saw him in high
I didn't
school, saw him
realize
in
coach
college.
coach scouted him. I didn't realize that.
Yes, Don Welke driving all over the Midwest in his K car,
Yeah.
uh, and he just he took a liking to Jim, what was inside him, and what drove him, and so much of the book was about his challenge, um, and was that sword or shield, right? Was this the thing that drove him? Was this the thing that protected him?
Hmm.
And Jim is a very thoughtful guy, and so thought through all those things. And what was really interesting about the book is obviously Jim was very good early in his career, and then was not very good. Lost velocity, uh, never really figured out a great breaking ball. Always had the cutter curveball kind of thing, but never figured out something to get guys off the cutter if they were going to start hitting that. And he he learned that he would be judged solely as a pitcher when he was not pitching well. So when it was going great, he was the the talk was, wow, look at this one-handed guy
Yeah.
making it in the big leagues. And when his ERA was 6, it was like, man, Jim Abbott stinks. He can't pitch at all. And
Yeah.
the lessons in that I thought were awesome, really interesting, and something that took him a long time. He's like I said, a very thoughtful guy, a very feeling guy, and it was such a joy to sort of circle back on both of our youths. Really, I mean, who were we then, and how do we figure this all out, and how does it look from where we stand now? Um, so that was the Jim Abbott experience, and it was beautiful.
It's incredible. I mean, even if this guy never won a game in the big leagues, the story is just amazing. I mean, you kind of gloss over the fact this guy didn't spend a day in the minor leagues. This guy was an Olympic gold medalist. Like this guy did so much. And I mean, I look at it through like the lens of a father now and trying to figure out, when do you protect your kids and when do you sort of push them and make them kind of stand on their own 2 feet and go through some adversity for the sake of going through adversity sometimes, right? And
Right.
I've got a friend who similarly wasn't born um, with a disability, but went through it, had a car accident and lost his leg. And I had a conversation with him recently, and he was genuinely grateful for the experience because again, this comes with age and maturity, right? Like you talked about with Jim, but it shaped obviously who he is now. And I don't think he was like a troubled youth heading down the wrong path or anything, but he was like, look, I was cocky, I was brash, my priorities weren't in line, and I just had this like piece about me shortly after the accident of like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. This was supposed to happen, and this is how I'm supposed to get through it. And I just think there's so much for people to learn from folks that go through something like that. Or Jim was born with it, so he never knew any better, right? That was just him.
Right, and this was sort of one of the overriding themes in his life. His dad was was pretty hard on him. He was not going to allow Jim to use as an excuse uh, for whatever, whether it be socially in high school, or on a, he was a punter quarterback on his high school football team. He played basketball, and everybody tried to make him go right, you know uh,
Yeah.
and uh, his dad was always this very no nonsense guy. Like, hey, you know, this is what life looks like for you. And the what I and here's the segue for you. The guy who was so instrumental in sort of allowing Jim to find himself. He had oddly enough, if you go from the campus of Michigan to the big leagues, we talk about baseball as a sport of failure. Jim was a fantastic high school player, hit 450 or whatever, was a fantastic college player, went down to Cuba with Team USA and beat Cuba on Cuban soil. The first guy to do that in like 60 years in a
Right.
packed stadium, and then go straight to the big leagues. We talk about baseball as a sport of failure, but at that point, Jim had not really failed. He
Yeah.
had been run off some playgrounds and stuff along the way, and he had to figure out a different way to do things, but had not really failed. And a guy who came into his life named Harvey Dorfman, and I know you know the name Harvey Dorfman,
Of course.
and Scott Boras brought Harvey in because he realized that Jim was going to have some struggles, that there were going to be difficulties in his life, that there was a lot to carry around. Um, that he was what Doug Rader used to call carrying the flag for such a big part of our society. People who had challenges, physical challenges, and Harvey Dorfman would always say the same thing. Well, what are you going to do about it? And interestingly enough, Harvey was became something like a father figure to Rick Ankiel, uh, with that same mantra. Okay, you can't throw a strike. What are you going to do about it? Okay, you're not getting hitters out anymore. What are you going to do about it? Okay, Jim, you feel drawn into this world of kids and parents and things who uh, just want to know they're going to grow up okay. They're going to have friends. They're going to go to prom. They're going to have a job. They're going to have all that stuff. And as much as you love doing it, it can be a drain. It can pull you away from the thing you want to do. So, what are you going to do about it? Instead of moping and sitting around feeling sorry for yourself, and Harvey was great for both of them in that regard. And I spent a lot of time talking to Harvey for the Jim book. Sadly, he had passed by the time I had gotten going on the Ankiel book. But man, it was he was. We talk about the sort of the emotional, the mental part of all of this, and you could be this fantastic athlete. I mean, Jim, big guy, huge calves. The left side of his body was just enormous. And Rick, maybe one of the great athletes baseball has ever seen.
Hmm.
Uh, Imagine giving away all of those formative at bats from the time you're 18 years old to 23. Thousands of at bats where guys figure out how to hit cutters and lay off sliders and catch up to fastballs and things like that Rick never had, and circled back and became a big league outfielder. Are you kidding me? All the while, and I can't say enough about the Harvey Dorfman element of how you get your head around allowing yourself to do that, giving yourself a way to um, uh, competing, just just competing
Yeah.
and doing something about it.
I love the angle on Jim. And it says more about us than him, right? Like this guy was born without a hand, and so we kind of put our pity hat on for him right away. And you're like, this guy's never. Yeah, he probably had some run-ins on the playground. This guy's never failed. All this guy has gone out and done is win and win at like the highest levels. And so I had never really thought of it from that perspective of when this guy fails, he's not going to have the same resources probably at his disposal. This guy doesn't have a hand, so he's going to be limited in sort of the plan B in the recovery of, okay, now you've failed, now what are you going to do about it? Like that's it's a great perspective on just people dealing with what everybody's got baggage, everybody's dealing with something, right? And so do you treat that as to your point, sword or the shield? Is it a disability, is it a hindrance, or is it kind of your superpower?
Sort of leading with that, right? And one of the one of the anecdotes I really loved in the Jim Abbott book was he had been traded to the Yankees and was not pitching well. And the New York Times came out with a piece uh, basically grading the Yankees at the All Star break. Who's doing well, who's not doing well. And one of the categories was underachieving. And he lists a bunch of guys, Jim Abbott, underachieving. And Jim remembers picking up the paper that morning and seeing that he, Jim Abbott, the guy with one hand pitching for the Yankees, was underachieving, and
Right.
he lost his mind, right? And he got to the ballpark and he yelled at the writer, and within 20 minutes he felt so bad about it because he realized, I'm finally being judged as a pitcher, the one thing that
Right.
I've always wanted, and now it's finally happened, and I'm mad about it.
Hmm.
That just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, and the desire to be treated just like anybody else, right? Which is what a lot of people want. And your point about it's what's the quote? It's that success has a million fathers and failure is an orphan, something along those lines, right? So Jim's
Right.
when he's pitching well, oh look at this, this great human interest story. He's overcome all this adversity. It's incredible. And then when he stinks, nobody can talk about that, right? He's
Right.
failing with one hand. It's just, oh, this guy's not pitching very well.
Right. Right. Uh,
um, shifting to Ankiel, because I remember when he made that. I remember his whole career, but coming up, he was out of this world talented. And then now, I mean, people that are watching the game now probably have a distorted lens of reality with what Otani's doing, right? I mean that never happened. I mean, Babe Ruth wasn't doing
right.
that kind of stuff, right? So, but Ankiel was probably the closest thing we had to that prior to. And I just remember being like, had a similar thought when Tim Tebow was trying to play baseball, right, or did play baseball, and he was like,
I
man,
think you're
this,
right the first time, maybe.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. But I'm like, man, this guy's gonna just pivot like that and go relearn to hit, right, and do it at the high, and sure enough, he gets there and he does it. But yeah, just the testament to the athleticism and the ability to battle through that, and the natural ability, obviously. But I don't think people can appreciate how extraordinary that was at the time, and really still is.
Yeah, I agree. And so my experience with Rick was interesting. I was working at the LA Times when Rick was a rookie, and the Angels had traded. Remember, Angels traded Jim Edmonds to the Cardinals,
Yeah.
and Jim was always an interesting figure in LA. You know, an amazing athlete, great player, uh, but could be out there a little bit. And so the Times sent me to St. Louis to do this piece about, hey, all right, Jim Edmonds, let's go sort of check him out. Where's his head at? How does he feel about the trade? Um, things like that. So I get to St. Louis, and it's early in the season, and it's cold, and it's sprinkling out, and it's dark. Just one of those St. Louis early season nights where it was just heavy. Everything felt heavy.
Hmm.
And the guy on the mound was this young left-hander, Rick Ankiel. Um, and I was like, cool. I've read a lot about the next Koufax, all that stuff. Let's see what this kid's all about. And I think it was against the Brewers. And so I'm sitting in the press box, and Jim has been ignoring me for like 3 days at this point. So I'm just hanging around, talking to whatever Billy Ryan I could find, just sort of waiting for. I told Jim, I said, I'm not leaving. So,
Right.
you know, uh, so I'm watching this game, and up comes Abbott, and I've got my sort of head down, looking at things and popping my head up, and bang,
Edmonds,
crack of
right?
the
Not
bat.
Abbott.
I'm sorry, Ankiel. Rick Ankiel comes
Sorry.
up.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, the pitcher comes up and hits this opposite field tracer shot into the bullpen on this rainy, dark, horrible night. And I thought, what? What am I looking at here? How does that even happen?
Right.
Um, so this is what I've been carrying around, and in the meantime, I go off and I covered the NBA for a few years and then came back to baseball. And by then, Rick was an outfielder. And the very next time I ever sort of thought about Rick or wrote a story about Rick was when he hit the home run for the Braves, uh, basically in extra innings, basically to beat the Giants up in San Francisco in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so fascinated by his whole thing that in that moment I thought, wow, imagine that. Imagine being able to do all that stuff. Um, and then years later, of course, Rick was ready to tell his story. And I think interestingly, because Jim had always been Abbott had always been reluctant to write a book because he never wanted it to look like he was trading in on his challenges.
Yep.
And Rick, of course, the whole Yips thing was just devastating, absolutely devastating for him because not only did other people think he was going to be the next Koufax, he thought he was going to be the next Koufax, and he embraced that. And the fact that he wasn't, it made him angry. It made him dark. The last thing he wanted to do is talk about that stuff. And so, while Jim's story was somewhat untold because of one reason, Rick's story was completely untold because you can't have the story until he tells it. And so when he was getting ready to write to sort of tell his story, um, we connected and we had a couple long talks, and I spoke to his wife and all. And I thought, what was really interesting was the dad element to it, and what you have is a childhood where I don't know how much you know about Rick's dad, but not a great guy, in and out of jail, abusive, according to Rick and Rick's mom, for that matter. And so Rick always knew where the fight was. The fight was always standing in front of him, uh, sweating, probably drunk, uh, might have just gotten out of the clink
Mm-hmm.
and angry. And then suddenly from that comes this fight that you can't get your arms around. You can't see it. As much of a fighter as he was, and as hard as he fought to get out of that situation and make some money and get out of that house, now suddenly um, an even more difficult fight comes along, and the guy won't stand up to you. Right? It's out there. It's in your own head. It's in the
Right.
house. The call
Right.
is coming from in the house,
Yeah.
uh, and so that to me was sort of the very interesting part. You could see Jim's challenge, you could not see Rick's challenge, and I'm not sure which is more devastating. It's
Yeah.
probably a tie at the end of the day.
Yeah. And to your point about just the whole look, there's a ton of focus now on sort of mental health, mental awareness across sports, which I think is great, but it's still not like the layman doesn't, the average fan doesn't understand. Players have anxiety or players have whatever's going on, and there's like, oh, you know what, like rub some dirt on it. You're making millions of bucks, get out there. But your point about Rick embracing that like spotlight, right? I'm gonna be the next Koufax, let's go. And he was like uber talented. And then I don't know, it almost would have been easier if he blew his arm out and then just wasn't the same guy. But all of a
Right.
sudden, he can't do what he was able to do, and you can't even understand why he can't do it. Right? It's a mental thing, and that's like that'll take its toll on you.
Yeah, it was humiliating, and it was humiliating every single day, and it's not the sort of thing you walk away from the ballpark and it's over. It's all you
Right?
think about.
Right?
A lot of these guys, uh, they go to the same place when this happens. That's the bottom of a bottle because it's
Mm-hmm.
the only place where you have some freedom. And I found it interesting, Billy, and I think you would too, as a guy who was around baseball for so long. Rick, when he got out of the game, spent a couple of years as a life skills coach for the Washington Nationals, and he and I were speaking a lot during this time, and so he would travel around the minor leagues and talk to guys, and basically his job description was to hang around and say, "Hey, how you feeling? How you doing? What can I help with?" And he said it's never been more prevalent, the anxieties, the mental distress that's going on in the minor leagues. And as we spoke about it, I sort of came to the realization, I was a young guy covering the Angels, and Tim Salmon comes up for the first time, and you think, oh, well, this guy, they seem to like him. Well, let's see if he's any good. And it was basically the first time you really saw him, the first time you gave a lot of thought. Uh, but these guys today, with the internet, with social media, I mean, you can go back and get Dylan Cruz swinging from when he was 12 years old
I
on
know.
the internet wherever you want, and
Uh-huh.
interviews, and you can see every game he's ever played. And I was thinking about it last night watching the draft, and how these guys are so different because of what they've grown up in. um, and the pressure on these guys, the money that comes along with being one of these high draft picks, uh, the fact that in baseball, it's not like football or basketball, where you go be a superstar at this big college and everybody goes there and everybody knows who you are and you're on TV every weekend and all that stuff. You just go disappear, and then you go home to your hometown and people are like, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I've been in Auburn for 2 years." Really? How come you're not in the big leagues yet? And so this pressure mounts and mounts and mounts. And
Hmm.
if you're, and you look at these guys, the young guys who come up and at 20 years old, that hit 320 and are all stars and all that stuff. And that pressure is just enormous. And he said it doesn't always play in the yips. It does sometimes. Guys are right on the edge. You can see it, but it takes over their lives in other areas. And it really is something, he said, that needs to be tended to, because it's just getting so big. This ball of anxiety that everybody's carrying around for success, to get to the big leagues, to make your money, to all these things that maybe didn't exist 25 years ago. Because I mean, you'd have to go to Baseball America and it's just a name, a
Right.
bold-faced name in a notebook, and that was all you knew about the guy.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I mean, Rick's
uh,
probably he's probably lucky that he went through that when he did and not now. I mean, you talk about
oh
not being able to, you know, you carry it with you in your head, but you can't escape it now. I mean, it's there would be, every social media platform and YouTube and everything else would be clips of that all over the world, people commenting, making smart ass comments and everything. Yes, you're talking about the Dylan Cruz swings when he's 12. My son's 5. Okay, he's about to be 6, and he's like, "Hey, I want
yeah,
to."
I've seen him hit. Yeah, he's good.
I want to. He goes, I want to play flag football. I was like, all right, do you know what flag football entails? He's like, not really. I'm like, well, all right, so let's go on YouTube and I'll find a clip of 6-year-old flag football, just so you get a sense of like what's going on. So it says like 6U highlights. I'm like, this will be perfect. This is a game, and I load it up, and it's Johnny Smith's highlight video, and they've got the hype music and the graphics and the shadow box to follow him around. And I'm like, this kid's 6 playing flag football, and they're trailing him like Mel Kiper's watching him going after the quarterback on the draft. I'm like,
This
this
is
is
scouting tape.
it is. It's a scouting. It's a recruiting tape at 6, and so it's just we've jumped the shark so much on that stuff where it's like if you don't have that, you'll never be a big leaguer now, or you'll never be, you won't get a scholarship. I'm like, believe me, they're going to find you if you're good enough, But
Right.
um, I had Snit on earlier in the year, Brian Snicker, and he talked about just how the clubhouse really is like the last safe place for
Right.
players, and they used to be able to hop in a cab or go home or even go out to eat. Because to your point, like until you were like a real dude, like an all-star at the big leagues, it's baseball in particular, people didn't maybe recognize you. And so
Right.
now you can't go anywhere. Everybody's got a phone in their pocket and they're taking it out and, misinterpreting something you're doing in public. And all of a sudden you got to answer questions the next day.
Yeah. Yeah. We go back to that thing I was talking about earlier about baseball's a game of failure. But really, has Mike Trout really ever failed? Um,
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit. The first year he came up in that September, I think he hit 200 or something like that. But when it comes, it comes hard,
Yeah.
and it's devastating. And I think that I do feel like we are at least becoming more empathetic, because we all have our anxieties, right? None of us want to be standing out there all the time.
Hmm.
And so I think it's interesting, and I think hopefully we're becoming a more sympathetic society and understanding when tennis players go home and say, I'm not going to play for a while because of my mental health or whatever. I think we've become a little more understanding with that, hopefully, but it still doesn't take away the fact that it's out there.
Right.
The fact that everyone's talking about it, that Rick Ankiel had to show up at 5:30 in the morning to throw his bullpens,
Right.
to poor Mike Matheny, who had to drag his butt out of bed that
Yeah.
early to go do it, because they were trying to beat the media there,
Yeah.
and get something done without it feeling like it was either the beginning or the end of the world.
So I want to shift a little bit to your new book, which I'm super excited about. Um, Tell me a little bit, the Tao of the Backup Catcher. Tell me a little bit about the impetus behind writing that.
Uh, I think the big background is I covered baseball for 30 some years, and about my favorite guy in every clubhouse was the backup catcher. I just felt like there was humility there, there was professionalism there. Uh, they picked their heads up and saw the world. Uh, I just liked those guys. They were accessible. They were human beings. They were easy to talk to. And along the way, Eric and I had become acquainted, and I loved his story. This is a guy who he goes to a division, tiny little town outside of Philadelphia, goes to a Division III school, gets on the radar of a young new scout for the Toronto Blue Jays, who sort of fell in love with him and maybe had no reason to. Uh, Caught every for he was at Eastern Mennonite University for 4 years. Caught every single pitch thrown at that school for 4 years, um, with a borrowed glove, by the way, that he gave back at the end of the 4 years.
Oh, that's amazing.
Um, and uh, and then it went from a guy who never didn't play to a guy who never played, and his wife Sarah, and 19 professional seasons, grinding it out, and as much as I loved his story, I thought that there was something bigger there, that there was something to do about not just one backup catcher, but all of the backup catchers, because what they represented resilience, they represented who you wanted to be. They represented showing up every day. And beyond that, I think they're emblematic, perhaps, of who the rest of us are, right? When the whole dream doesn't arrive, what do you do with that? You know, um, so you're not in the
Yeah,
box.
none of these guys dreamed of being a backup catcher when they were kids, right?
No, and there's so I think about the stay-at-home mom or dad, the nurse, the teacher, the firefighter, all the people who maybe some days wake up and think, I'm not really in the box score. I'm not getting my uniform dirty today. Um, you know, it, am I appreciated? And so I feel like the traits, the habits of the backup catchers maybe reflected the best of among us out here in the real world, of uh, you know being a good teammate, showing up every day for the greater good, winning games in the 21 hours around the games, uh, you know and who are we to other people? you know who'd you make better today? Because these guys, they caught bullpens, they picked up signs, they led from behind at times, and 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 they kept showing up, and they just refused to get sort of beaten down by a system that, gosh, 15 years ago decided they can't hit. so they become a backup catcher. And as soon as the system decided they couldn't hit, they weren't going to hit because they weren't going to get any at bats. So, I mean, you could make an argument. Eric Kratz, I think, is a career 209 hitter playing once a week. I mean, you got to be a damn good hitter to hit 209 if you're playing once a week.
That's hard to do. Yeah.
It really is. And so I just sort of fell in love with his story and his wife, Sarah, uh, how she sort of propped him up along the way, all these years of driving all over the country and eating macaroni and cheese every night for weeks, and who they were and what they stood for and how they went about it. And at the end of these 19 pro seasons, he had fewer than 900 big league at bats. Uh, and I'll tell you what, Billy. The one thing that really got me is, I mean, I talked to dozens and dozens of backup catchers for this book, and at the end of every interview, I would ask them, are you proud of your career in the end? Even if it didn't look like what you thought it was going to look like, and you're a 197 career hitter, and you got DFA'd 43 times, and they'd all say the same thing. He said, I'm proud of being a good teammate. And I think that there's so much there that this is what um, you know this is what I wanted to write for years about. Sort of um, we all see the superstars. There are a lot more of these guys in the game that make the game great than there are superstars. And I know we can't take our eyes off Otani, uh, but these other guys are what make the game. There's no game without these guys.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the characteristics you just touched on, those guys tend to be really well respected in the clubhouse too, because they are good teammates, and certainly everybody in the clubhouse, players and staff, see all the work that they put in behind the scenes, and all anybody else sees is the three at bats and the one game they catch every 8 to 10 days,
Right,
right? And
right. And
so,
everybody groans because
uh,
Yachty's not in the lineup tonight,
right,
right? And you're
right.
the guy like, thanks for the groan, appreciate that. you know,
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and we would always talk about it from like a front office perspective of like, okay, this guy's got talent. Um, it's not. I don't think it's coincidence that the everybody talks about like high school pitching, but high school catching coming out of the draft is the lowest success rate. That is like all these demographic. Every time you hear a high school catcher taking the first round, they're like, "This kid's great," but
yeah,
and then you
right.
hear like all
Oh,
of
okay. Let's see how
the
that goes.
bodies along strewn along the highway, but um, you would see kids in the minor leagues or even guys at upper minors, 4A type guys, whatever they might be, even big leaguers. You're like, okay, I don't think this guy's an everyday big league. I don't think he's an everyday catcher, right? Or he's definitely not an everyday catcher. But then you have the secondary conversation of like, can this guy be a backup? Like, yes, physically he can do it. There's no doubt. But this guy's worried about hitting it 450 in BP. This guy's worried about, making sure he gets as much camera time as possible, whatever. You have to have a special kind of makeup to embrace that. It's kind of like the offensive line. You got to like getting beat up a little bit. You got to like the behind the scenes work to be successful and have longevity in that role.
Yeah, and it's so hard too because you, opening day. I would always think about this on opening day. Everybody's lined up on the baselines and everything, and everyone's. You think about, let's say, Mike Trout. He's probably standing out there thinking, well, I'm going to hit 320, or am I going to hit 295? Am I going to hit 30 home runs, or am I going to hit 45? Am I going to go back to the All-Star game this year? I don't know. You sort of all these opening day sort of, I wonder what the season's going to bring. And then you drift your eyes down just a little bit, shoulder to shoulder with everybody. You got this guy who's standing there thinking, I wonder if I'm going to be on this team in 4 days.
Yeah.
I wonder if I'm going to hit
Yeah.
210 or 110. Please don't let it be 110. I wonder, I wonder where my family is. I'm in this hotel that I have to get out of by Friday, and I don't have a place to stay yet. And the kids are 3 and 5, and I mean, it's such a different experience that they're having. And uh, look, the major league minimum is it. It's good money, but not if you're making it for like a week at a time.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's good. It's good money for a full season.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I would always think about those guys and what they must be like. What a thrill it was, obviously, to make an opening day roster because so many of them, they can count those on one hand at best.
Right.
Um, but it's just not easy. And I think hopefully this book will sort of outline for people not just about the like how to be a backup catcher, but how to be a quality human being. How do you be where your feet are, and how do you sort of tend to the other people in your life who may need you. The middle reliever who can't find his slider, the starter who needs. I mean, you become as a backup catcher, as you well know, father figure, big brother, priest, therapist, drinking buddy. That's your job. Every GM told me we got a 26-man roster, 25 guys fit the analytical model. One guy does not. Is he a good dude? Is he a leader? Am I going to have to worry about him ever? Is he ever going to go to the manager and wonder why he's not playing? That guy, I just need a guy that I'm not going to have to worry about. And if you could just please hit 210, that's all I'm asking. Just good at bats, frame up some pitches, um, get this guy's head out of his butt, and you're going to have a job here. So it's just a
Yeah.
completely different assignment than everybody else has.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. In a lot of ways, it's an extension of your coaching staff. What
Right.
what are you going to value? What do you want? What's your pitching coach going to stress? Because you're the guy that's spending all the time with him in the bullpen. It's not the starting catcher. The starting catcher's in the game. Your point about opening day. Some of the times these guys don't even get to line up on it because they're down warming up. Sometimes the starting
Right.
catcher gets to wave to the crowd and like, all right, here's Eric Kratz, and he just kind of gives a back of the hand wave because the
Right.
camera's on him, and nobody sees him again.
Right. And that's a great point because the backup catcher, because he is getting there at 2:30 in the afternoon and catching side pieces, and a lot of times he's in the bullpen warming guys up. So he may know the pitching staff better than the number one catcher does. He's also typically bouncing back and forth between the big leagues and the minor leagues. And as an older guy, you're in AAA. You're helping to raise the next generation of catchers. You're helping to raise the next generation of pitchers, and maybe even raise the next generation of managers and coaches because you've been there, you've seen it, you know how things go in the big leagues, and these guys need some direction. I mean, I think I counted up the other day because it varies, but I think 14 of the 30 current managers in the big leagues were backup catchers.
I was just gonna say, I don't think that's an accident either. It's
Right.
it's just the perspective you have of the game, but all those soft skills that you either have just innately or you have to develop to some extent, because you're an extension of the player development system. You're an extension of the major league coaching staff. You're an extension of the pitching staff. You're an extension of the position players, and you have to like walk between all of these worlds. And that's a unique skill set. A lot of guys can't do that.
Yeah, and there was an interesting conversation sort of across the book about whether those types of guys, those types of players are born or bred, right? I mean, can you become an empathetic, uh, uh, friendly, decent human being? Or do you have to start with that and then learn catching skills, right?
Right, right.
The one guy who I think made the biggest transition or transformation in the course of the book was David Ross, a guy who went to Atlanta and learned how to be a backup catcher. He had had problems in Cincinnati with Dusty about he had been a number one guy, and then he started platooning, and then he sort of lost that job, and then he got released, and the Red Sox signed him. And at the end of that year, the Red Sox had a decent year. They lost before, I think they lost to the Rays somewhere in the playoffs. And Theo, who has, a really great touch with like the world outside of baseball, and went to, he was just walking through the clubhouse at the end of the year and saw David Ross sitting there. Ross hardly played at all with the Red Sox that year. in the last 2 months and into the playoffs, and said, "Hey, you got to sort of figure out who you want to be. If you're going to fight this thing that you are, this is what you are now, and you can either fight it and be out of the game, or accept it and become great at it, and have as long a career as you want to have." And that's when he went to Atlanta. It was behind, I believe, Brian McCann, probably, um,
Yep.
and learned how to be a backup catcher, learned how to be a backup guy, and became one of the great. I mean, it sounds funny. One of the great backup catchers of all time.
No, I think that is an accolade that should exist.
Right.
I mean, that's a great point. The guys that is a very different evolution or very different career path and career in general, being the guy who's always scratching and clawing and trying to hang on and be the 26th guy on the roster, and you're up and down between AAA and the big leagues, versus the guy who, hey, I've got 1,000 at bats in the big leagues, and I'm a this and that. I was an everyday guy for a couple of years, and we're like, well, yeah, now you no longer are, right?
Right.
Like, just for one reason or another, you're not that guy anymore. And what do you want? Or your earlier point, what do you want to do about it?
Right. There's an interesting the difference in experiences when you wake up in Asheville, North Carolina, and realize, holy crap, no matter what they told me back in my hometown, no matter what the scouts told me, no matter what my early coaches told me, I'm not going to be the next Johnny Bench. It's become very clear I'm not going to be the next Johnny Bench. It's a different experience if you have that, at a Ritz Carlton in Boston, right? And
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
and you're a grown man and you have a family and all that stuff, and so, you know, I don't know which would be more difficult. But I do that flashpoint of, okay, my entire dream is probably gone, but I can still grab onto parts of that dream if I can be this person, if I can give myself away to being this guy, along with, I mean, you don't ever stop trying to be whatever it is you want to be, a
sure.
number one catcher, the next Johnny Bench or whatever. But in the meantime, just being where your feet are, and understanding what your job is and doing that job. Your 20-minute side session is your game today. Is that going to be enough for you? Because if not,
Yeah.
you should go sell, you know, houses for a living, or something, because
Yep.
this isn't going to work out.
No, I would love watching that exact scenario, or scenarios like that play out in real time, whether it was in the big leagues or the minor leagues. And the player's not happy with his lot in life at the moment.
Right.
And you're just going to watch him. You're going to watch. This is your job now. How are you going to approach it? Are you going to be the professional that's gonna make the most of it and give the A effort, and if it's catching a bullpen, maybe make your teammate a little bit better, make some suggestions, or are you just gonna kind of sleepwalk through it and be like, all right, I'm here, I got on the chest protector, what do you want?
Right.
And to your earlier point about big league managers, that's clearly not a coincidence. Whether those guys have that, you're born like that, or you develop those skills, that relatability, that ability to appreciate not just physically what the pitcher is trying to accomplish, or what the pitching coach is trying to accomplish, but who they are as people. How do you relate to them? How do you motivate them? How do you tie all those little pieces together to build a roster and lead a roster? Those guys did that when they were in uniform as players. And so then, yeah, of course you're going to follow that path and then become a coach and then eventually become a manager and probably be a pretty good one.
Right. And I think if you're resisting all those things as a human being, as an athlete, you're probably not, you're going to be too wound up in yourself, in I'm getting screwed. The game hates me, to be of any benefit at all to the people around you.
Yep. Yep. 100%. And the funny thing about the backup catchers, independent of all we've talked about, is those softer skills, that the EQ probably, they also tend to be pretty good characters, right? You have to have some really good stories from, that I'm sure some of them are captured in the book, of pranks and whatever it may be, because these guys are, a lot of them are pretty sharp, perceptive. They know how to push buttons. So it's part of what makes them good managers down the road, right? So you've got to have some great stories in
Yeah. It's funny. I had a great conversation with Mike Redmond, who, of course, is the known for the naked batting practice. And It was funny because I sort of waited when I was talking to him. I waited for that to be the last question. Um, uh, the naked batting practice turns into a World Series championship, and uh, and I waited because I thought to myself, here's a guy, he had a really good career, wasn't really well regarded early in his career and became something and became a manager and, a well regarded coach and all that stuff. And I said to him, I said, in spite of all that, what everybody knows about you is you took batting practice naked all the time. And he's like, well, you got it was important. It was part of the job description. Is
That's a weird
is
job description.
yeah, is to keep guys light and keep guys laughing and
Yeah.
and and be the fool because I'm not playing that day. So how do I sort of keep guys going? I think that
Yeah.
one of the interesting, and I turned this into an entire chapter on the book because I think it speaks to um, like what you value, like what your values are. Eric Kratz, 2 weeks before going to college, bought a pair of shower shoes, summer slides, Nikes. He was 18 years old. At 40, when he retired from the Yankees, he put those shower shoes into his garage because his wife was like, get those things out of the house.
Yeah.
The
Right.
same shower shoes for 23 years.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
what kind of guy does that? You just like,
Yeah.
I mean,
You're like,
I could have walked out of every clubhouse I'd ever been in with 4 new pairs of shower shoes. They just give those things away. They can't wait to
yeah,
give
of
them away.
course. Right. Right.
But Eric was always like, no. I mean, I think they cost him $11. He's like, no, they're fine. They're perfectly fine. They're still
Yep.
wearable. But that's
Yep.
sort of
Well, it's yeah, it does. It gives you a peek into his values, right?
uh,
There's some quirkiness and some weirdness there, right? It's like Bronson Arroyo with the flip phone after 15 years in the big leagues or whatever it is. It's the
right,
same kind of deal. But you're like, I like that. You're not caught
yeah,
up in all the other stuff.
right. I
And
don't care.
uh,
The one, and I'll give you one more, is I'm sure you've heard of Bill Plummer.
sure. Oh yeah, I work with Plum in Arizona. He's the best.
Great guy. And I don't know if people who are listening will know the story of Bill Plummer. He signs with the Cardinals out of Northern California, Redding, California, in 1965. Um, and in 1967, he's Rule 5 to the Chicago Cubs. In that between just before the 68 season. In the 68 season, the number one catcher for the Cubs, Randy Hundley, started 156 games at catcher and played 160 games at catcher. And Bill Plummer, as a Rule 5 guy with the Cubs, had 2 at-bats on the big league roster all year. What he did,
It's amazing.
he just threw a ton of BP. He swears that Leo DeRocher, the manager of the Cubs, did not know his name after a full year on the roster.
uh,
So that season ends, and Bill is a little disappointed. He would have liked to have played. He was in a little over his head, but that was the season of baseball gone. But he did become very good at throwing BP. He gets a call and says, "Hey, we're trading you." And he thought, "Oh, good. Where am I going?
finally some playing time.
I'm going to get me some playing time. Here we go. We trade you to Cincinnati." Okay. He thinks that over. The Reds have a catcher there who is younger than Bill Plummer and
Uh
already an
huh.
all-star by the name of Johnny Bench,
Uh huh.
which is pretty much where he said, "Okay, I guess I'm a backup catcher forever."
Right.
And that's where
This is where I am now.
you sort of accept his whole thing. And you know what? Years later, we had such a great talk. He's such a good man and has such
Yeah, he
great
is.
perspective. Uh, he's just like, you know what? I just showed up and did my job every day. He said, I knew who I was and where I was, and I threw a lot of batting practice. And he was Johnny Bench's roommate, and he figured out ways to sleep where he wouldn't snore to keep him up. And he broke in he broke in Johnny Bench's mitts. He would catch all of his bullpen sessions with a brand new mitt, break it in. When it was good to go, he'd give it to Johnny, and Johnny would go in gold gloves with it.
Right. Right.
And
Oh, that's
so
amazing.
that's the life, man. That's where you show up, and here I am.
Well, and no shocker that he then followed that path, and
Became a
has had
manager.
a long coaching career, right? A
Right.
long coaching and managing career, and that the unassuming, just style of Plums, and yeah, he's mentoring these 19-year-old catchers,
Yep.
who have no earthly idea who he is or who he roomed with or what he did and whatever, and
Right.
that's just that ability to relate to people, and it ties back to that and be able to motivate them. But that's so great. I mean, I could picture Plum's face when I'm getting traded to Cincinnati.
Oh no.
Okay, great,
Oh no.
great.
But you know what? I mean, where do you like World Series championships and floats and parades in
Right.
Cincinnati and all that stuff? Where do you I don't know, where do you slot all that stuff in your life? Like, would you rather have gotten 5,000 more at bats, or would you
Right.
rather have that
Be a part
experience?
of history.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, it's a great point. Well, Tim, I'm so excited to read this book. I told you earlier, I think it's the perfect marriage of really nuanced, interesting, entertaining subject matter and your writing style. I'm admittedly biased as a former college catcher, but the universe that you're writing about and describing, and I think it's going to be a really compelling story to share with folks beyond just baseball or even sports. I mean, I think there's a lot to learn to the rest of the world for a lot of the reasons we've touched on.
I'm hoping there's a nice crossover that people feel that it's speaking to them, whether they're professional ball player or not.
Right. Right. Maybe less naked batting practice in the, around the water cooler,
Or
but
not,
you never know.
whatever you want.
You're
Whatever you want. Billy,
Tim, thanks
it's
for
been
taking
a
the time,
joy,
man.
man. It's been a joy. It's so great to catch up with you again, and thank you for spending this time.
No, thank you. I appreciate the time and can't wait to read the new book, The Tao of the Backup Catcher, Tim Brown. Thanks for listening to this episode of the No One Is Watching podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to hit subscribe to be notified of future episodes. If you'd like to support the show, please take a second, leave a rating and review, or share it with your friends. If you're interested in similar content, you can check out my website at nooneiswatching.com, where you can subscribe to the newsletter, read my blog, or follow me on your social media platform of choice. Look, your time is valuable, so thank you for lending me some of it. We'll see you next time.